I think a bit of background to this. We issue the proposed budget papers several weeks ahead of this meeting to encourage comment, and we've received some comment. But behind the scenes, before we get to this stage, I think it'd be useful to know that a lot of effort goes into coming up with this proposal. Several weeks before we issue this, we have a variety of scenarios that we run, and we come up with what we think is the best overall result for the budget. And this year we've come up with a proposal that we reduce LON 1 and LON 2 prices by 15%. In doing that, we've recognised that this year we're going to have a better result than we expected. We predicted a £750,000 loss, and we're probably going to be somewhere near break even, and that's a mixture of factors that's come into that. But what that has meant is that we do have cash reserves that we weren't expecting, and we are planning to share those out. This is the means by which we can get the money back to our members in doing the 15% reductions. What that does mean is we are looking at a loss of somewhere near £900,000 next year. And in our structure, we're not like a normal company that can, when you have a good year, you can give a dividend. If you have a bad year, you don't. Once we give these price cuts, it's basically embedded into the future, unless you're going to be willing to accept price increases, which I assume you're probably not too keen to do that. So we have to be fairly prudent in the way we approach this. So we run a model that goes out 5 years to see if we give this price reduction now, is that sustainable in the long term? And we put a lot of time and effort into looking at that as to what makes sense as a natural progression, rather than being very dramatic and then having problems in the future. So we've issued this for comment, and we're looking for endorsement today from you all, but probably, hopefully you've read it, and John and I are willing to take questions on that proposal. So,
James?
James from JISC. So I kind of like the budget as it stands. It seems to make sense. There's nothing I really don't like about it. Apart from, it seems to, the version that was sent out, only look 1 year into the future and doesn't seem to set a horizon for when maybe, say, 10 gig becomes the default included in the membership fee strategy, or 1 gig not being viable as a port option. I did like the comment that was made that Nova gets the first gig on a 10 gig port for free until they start using that capacity up, which I think is maybe a model to look forward to in the future. But generally, it's the thing that was missing from the document was a forward look as to where things are going.
Thanks, James. Yeah, a few things if I unpick that. I mean, I think what you're doing when you're exchange building is really a separate case than running the exchange, certainly the London exchanges. And we've actually explored a number of different approaches to that. To be honest, we've been brutally simple in the UK. We just made it free until we reached the point where we thought that takeoff was occurring. And that has worked sometimes and has not worked other times. The intervention by other parties, I noticed when I read back on the thread from when I was talking earlier that, reference was made to the intervention by government and local authority in Cardiff. I think that's actually shown what I always believed, which is, if it relies on that kind of stuff, then there's something wrong anyway. Having said that, what's going on in Scotland is quite interesting. I mean, I guess we learned from experience, and the use of public funds in encouragement, especially when someone's trying to achieve a political end, because that was clearly what was going on there. The best we can do in those circumstances is try to guide them not to waste money. And of course, that assumes that you've got influence. So, there's a whole zone there that I could witter on about, but, let's sort of park that. So I think trying to rationalize what you do when you're in exchange building mode compared to running a mature exchange, they're two different things. Having said that, we're well aware that there's an issue about people wanting to have incentives to upgrade. And I think if we could figure out the maths of some of that, then we'd do it. But trust me, the maths are difficult at the moment. I think the other stuff that you said about looking forward into the future, that's a very interesting challenge, and I worry all the time about whether or not we're achieving the right balance in transparency versus withholding information which is frankly quite dangerous to release. So you'll have seen that for many years I've made a very similar statement that if you publish the capital budget in detail, for example, then you're just inviting that to be the price when you talk to vendors. Now that's an obvious case, but I mention it just because it illustrates some of the tensions that sort of build up on that kind of thing. I mean, I guess the biggest reassurance I can give is that the board scrutinises this to, sometimes it feels to Malcolm and I an excruciating degree. Have we completely enjoyed the process of being asked really awkward questions on your behalf? Then,
I just love doing different versions of this.
So yes, there are a lot of iterations going on that try to address that kind of thing. So a standard thing that's been in our budget process for quite a few years is that sustainability question. What if you project this forward? What if you use just pure modelling rather than actual budgeting with all that implies to roll it forward, a few years and say, what does that look like? So I can assure you we've been doing that for quite a long time. We were probably a little remiss in not doing that for a long enough period. So I think we held this somewhat arrogant view that if you tried to do that for a long period of time, you ended up guessing things where you really had no basis for what you'd guessed. Now I can assure you that and this is true for the second year, I think, that we've tried to roll it forward 5 years. So we've tried to have something that goes beyond the budget horizon that actually extrapolates it out 5 years and asks the very simple question, is this sustainable? If this rate of cutting was either maintained or something close to it, would we fall off a cliff in some way if we did that? What's been much longer established is that we've always had a read ahead of 1 year beyond whatever budget we've proposed. So generally, if you look back at my statements over the years, you'll see that there's for as long as I can remember anyway, there's been an assurance there that a sustainability check has been carried out that says at the very least we know if we go another year beyond the year that we're budgeting for that we're confident about that. And generally we express that confidence in a somewhat coded way because there's something in there usually about whether or not we think additional price cuts might be possible within that second year horizon, if you see what I mean. I think if you try to look back over all the statements, and I am conscious of this when I write these things, sometimes it's complicated by the fact that we've done mid-year cuts anyway, or pulled forward what would have otherwise been an end of calendar year cut, so that you've got a kind of interrupt in what looks like the smooth flow. So if you look at the graph that's in the document that we produced, and it was actually one of the non-executive directors that said to me, "You're not illustrating this very well, John. What have you done about that?" And that was actually quite hard, wasn't it, Malcolm? You'll see that they don't have a consistent shape because what's going on there is some of those kind of mid-year cuts have a bearing on that. Quite frankly, I find some of this quite hard to write down and present. So it's an interesting question to draw that out to me because I had no idea that I was going to be answering that particular question when I came up to the platform. But in a rambly sort of way, hopefully I've covered most of the domain I think that you asked there, James.
The only other one was when we're going to get rid of...
Oh, yeah, sorry, yeah, you're right, the commoditization. Yeah, I mean, we look at the notion of commoditization all the time. I think what's been quite interesting working with EdgeCore is seeing how they really have commoditized, sort of scale width ports compared to what we've been used to with Juniper, for example, where we're forever fitting into the MX slots, and to some extent that kind of determines where that goes. Having said that, if you were listening carefully to what Mike was saying earlier, Fleming was saying earlier, we're due to do proof of concept. We use POC all the time as an acronym and very rarely actually expand it. The proof of concept workshops that we're planning to do are exactly to look at those kind of issues of testing a completely different generation hardware and seeing how we could start to migrate from the somewhat restricted slot platforms that we have at the moment into these things where you've got, full width 100 gig cards, versus the kind of 4 by 100 that fit into the slots at the moment. You'd like to think, we'd like to think, that by going to that much higher density, you start to get closer to commoditization of both 10 gig and 100 gig. And we'll see, because I know Juniper are acutely aware of that pressure, not just from us, but from the market generally. At the moment, I don't see us being all that close to full commoditization of 10 gig ports. So it is one issue that we've looked at, and we've tried to think what the carry forward on the prices we've projected within 5 years are about that. And certainly we've got a bit of a kink in the curves that we've assumed in those 5-year projections, that where we start saying to ourselves, it looks like that's occurring about there, frankly, without massive amount of precision at the moment. But, if we weren't doing that, then we're probably not pushing ourselves hard enough about that issue. So again, I'm sorry, it's a bit of a waffly answer, but we have looked at it. I don't think we see quite yet where that becomes the sort of reality that we'd be confident to sort of announce now and put in the document. Having said all that, I do remember what I wrote, which is that, and it picks up on the point that Malcolm made, when you present a budget where you're already proposing to declare a loss, one of the things you've got to think about is the issues that arise from that and how far do you go. So there's certainly a bit of scope, because probably a natural conservatism applies to some of the budgeting that we do. If we'd sat there with a growth curve that said it's going to expand massively, and then we look back over a few years and said, how well does that relate to what we've actually seen? The inflection point in 100 gig, for example, is barely discernible in any graphs that we could produce. I think Mike said earlier we're at 150. Actually, it's clicked over to 151 while we've sat here. And 150 is really not yet anywhere near critical mass, especially when you consider that that's actually spread across 4 platforms. So we've got 100 gig, at least 100 gig port on 4 of the 6 platforms that we operate. So, I can only waffle, I'm afraid, about that. I don't think we can give you anything that's of great precision yet.
Can I just add one thing on that? That the sensitivity we've got to deal with is that the income from 10 gig is still roughly the same as 100 gig. So we've got to be careful as to how we handle that.
Yeah. Sorry, I've just been prompted about another thing. Another bit of feedback that we got since we published the document, and we're now in that kind of purdah period where we didn't want to make changes in what we proposed because it was within the voting period that's specified in the M&A, is that we probably are going to defer starting charging in Scotland until we think that we have actually passed that exchange building point. So although it's not reflected in the document as we've published it, we've long established that we don't need to come out to consultation over a reduction in prices. You just sort of lie back and enjoy it. The budget is in no way dependent upon income from LINX Scotland. So if we were to defer the start date for charging for ports there, then it has absolutely minimal influence. So for those people who are interested in joining in Scotland, then please talk to us and we'll give whatever reassurances we can about what we're planning there. Rob.
It's always good to... See it on? It's always good to see a little bit of activity on what is otherwise quite a quiet list. And it shows that the members are passionate about links as well as about their money. Value is an incredibly subjective item. So I'll start by saying that as a very small member, we get excellent value for money out of links as far as we're concerned, particularly with the work that Malcolm does with the public affairs, which is worth an absolute fortune. My questions are two. The first is, how much, if any, does LINX put into financial planning of alternative charging models? Or does it stick with we have this as a membership fee, we charge this for ports? So you analyse, as you have 20 years of historical data, various different ways of funding the organisation. And the second thing is there room or plan still for something like a member-to-member market where LINX could facilitate things between members over which maybe they could make a commission?
I'll take the second one first. I mean, we continue to look at that. I think we have a slight worry that if we were to majorly distract ourselves into things that don't look at the moment like the primary mission, then there's a sort of risk that you take your eye off other important balls and to the cost. But it does come up. And at one point, there was quite a bit of championing internally of what we might do about that, to the extent that it even covered things like seeking group discounts on equipment and so on. And, if you stray into the world of fantasy, then there are plenty of things that a membership organisation could do. We've looked at what people have tried elsewhere, and there's not really a lot of kind of case evidence that this sort of thing works. So I can't promise you anything in the near term on that, but if you've got ideas and they catch fire within the LINX community, then why not? We're certainly not opposed to that line of thinking, but it's not the mainstream at the moment, if that's an adequate answer. So the first question was alternative pricing. So, I mean, I've got a long memory in this. I was going to say earlier that this is my 70th quarterly member meeting, and I've managed to miss 2 in my tenure as chief executive. I was the advocate internally of going to the partial traffic-based charging system. And I did that, and I sold it to the board, and I sold it to the membership on the basis that we were at a really awkward inflection point where it seemed to me that there was disproportionate benefit accruing sort of accidentally from where we'd found ourselves in the life cycle of Ethernet. So the jump from 100 meg to 1 gig to 10 gig to 100 gig has not been a smooth one, and sometimes we ended up kind of, I could argue with the benefit of hindsight, sort of accidentally as a victim of some of these things. So when we got to that point, and when and I was probably trying too hard to apply notions of fairness, we ended up all convincing ourselves in a room just like this that an element of traffic-based charging was the right way to go. It never exceeded about 25% of the total income of LINX. So although it was portrayed to the world as we'd moved to traffic-based charging, that wasn't actually true. It was mostly fixed port charging still with an element of traffic-based charging. But in the end, it proved to be terribly controversial, and unwinding it was actually even harder. So as we phased it out, it started to become a reduced amount of the way we charged for ports. The withdrawal process was really quite painful. I also feel that at that point, if you actually plot the growth curve of alternative exchanges to appearing at LINX, that we definitely offered advantage to what at the time we thought of as competitors. Now, there's a whole, I guess one day when I want to get this out of my system, perhaps I'll write a book about it or something, but it was a painful process. So why is that relevant to your question? Well, yes, of course, we look at alternative charging systems. I mean, I think some of the words that were said about what we've done with low-speed port prices have actually forgotten the case we made in the first place and the rationale that we put forward, and also even the controls, because what we didn't want to do is to encourage shoddy engineering as a result. I mean, that was a direct result of feedback we got from a large number of members. And that, since we don't repeat that in the budget presentation each year, those arguments can kind of get forgotten in time. So yes, we are actively looking at it. I think we'd love to get to the point where we could do things like partial ports, but that's a very easy word to say, but it actually comes with an awful lot of baggage to do with the conditions that you would apply, and what seems like a good idea to one person seems like a terrible idea to other people, and some people will simply just not buy it if the restrictions on it were not what they were assuming. So yes, we're constantly challenging ourselves over things like that, but making the economics work is a whole other question. We watch with interest what other exchanges do. So, for example, one of the things that we see happening in the exchange world is people bundling ports and giving volume discounts. And we keep saying to ourselves, well, since there's no actual saving in cost to us, then this is just a promotional measure. And I guess we're much more cautious and inertial over things like that, because generally speaking, when we do things like that, we want it to be something that can apply to everybody. We don't want you to be caught out in a special price rush where if you booked it on such and such a date, you have price A, and then, for others who didn't notice that going on or weren't in a position to take advantage of it, you don't get it. We've also noticed other exchanges who apply their terms and conditions such that if you don't sign the new version of the terms and conditions, then you don't get the prices associated with it. We don't want to play those kinds of games with people. It seems to me that that's bureaucracy gone mad. So by having a very open-ended system, LINX terms are just 1 month. We play with fire to some extent with then what happens, within what we do. But honestly, if you've got good ideas for how we might do things and still get cost recovery on a fair basis, we're always open to consider them. Is that a good enough answer, Rob? Anyone else? Well, we've got one more presentation to do, so don't feel guilty if you dismiss us early. Okay, Curtis? Well.